we're gonna get back to the interview in a second, but um, um, everybody and their mama is gonna speak on it, so I'm gonna speak on it, and I'm just gonna say this: I called it. I was fucking right. I said it on wax months ago. These fucking scumbags have shucked and jived all that they are able to shuck and fucking jive. Nobody's buying their bullshit anymore, and they only had one option left. And their one option is what happened today. And they fucking missed. They fucked up. I called it. I knew this was gonna happen. Good fucking God. What an absolute shit show. Back to the interview.
Free Manson and buttons that said Free Manson. So from the beginning, I had a positive feeling about him, or a more sympathetic feeling about him, probably than many other Americans did at the time, though it was fairly common in counterculture communities. So that was my initial reaction to the actual events that occurred. In 1975, when Lynette Fromm made her sort of semi-attempted assassination activity, you could almost call it, because it really didn't seem to be a serious assassination attempt. In any case, when she was arrested for attempted assassination of President Gerald R. Ford, that reawakened my attention after several years in the case, and in Manson particularly, in his philosophy. And Lynette Fromm spoke a great deal about her ecological beliefs, her anti-pollution beliefs, really ideology that has now become fairly common, but was then considered radical, about the necessity of stopping fossil fuel, of stopping corporate destruction of the ecology. So she fascinated me because she seemed cogent and lucid and not at all like the demented maniac that the mass media was presenting her as. So then in 1975, when I was a teenager, I began looking into, well, what are the actual beliefs of these people? And I found that even from what very little was available at the time, it really didn't jive with what the mass media and the trial had presented, and particularly the book Helter Skelter, which is unfortunately the source of what most of the public knows about this case. It didn't seem to make sense, because what I was looking at as far as direct statements from these people were not the demented ideology of creating a race war or killing people for no particular reason. So it just didn't make sense to me, though I really had no clear idea what the crime was about at the time. That made me doubt it strongly, if you follow me so far.
Oh, absolutely. So I'd like to hit the scene on both coasts at this time, if you don't mind. How did Timothy Leary figure into your research? And then I'd like to know about Topanga Canyon, because it seems like the West Coast rock scene had sort of moved south from San Francisco to Topanga. So how did that rock and roll culture of Topanga Canyon affect Manson and those who followed him?
Right. It's deeper than that even, but that, of course, is true. And Topanga Canyon in particular is not really looked at as closely as it should be. The connection between the Manson commune or Manson circle, which is what I think is a more accurate way of describing them, and the Manson family, which is, I'll explain later, was really a created label that they themselves never used for themselves at the time. But you did want me to mention the Timothy Leary connection before we got to the rock and roll enmeshment. So I just wanted to follow up on that, and then we can get into Topanga Canyon. After this fascination with Squeaky Fromm, and which got me looking into it in 1975, as I've mentioned elsewhere, but you did particularly want to get into that, and I think it's important, I encountered Timothy Leary at the Los Angeles Book Fair in 1976. In the 60s, he was the main proponent of LSD as a spiritual awakening force, and his biography, which I brought to be signed for me to this LA book fair, was called High Priest. So he was at least the proponent of LSD in the 60s and in the counterculture that the mass media focused on the most, and he became almost synonymous with spreading the idea that LSD was an awakening agent and something of great spiritual value. And he was called by Richard Nixon the most dangerous man in America. He was eventually put on trial. He also was deeply involved in the drug dealing underworld as well. So Timothy Leary was, a crucial person in the counterculture of the American 60s and worldwide. So he had been let out of prison in 1976, just then, and I met him at the LA Book Fair and spoke to him primarily because I had read that he had recently been released from Folsom Prison and had served time right next to Charles Manson. And I asked him about that. And at that time, I really only knew about the case, what was available in the media. He gave me a certain look and a smile that suggested something much deeper than I could convey over the radio. But he said, in a way that really struck me, there is so much more to this case than anyone can ever imagine. And he spoke about how the Charles Manson that he heard, he never met him, but he heard him next door. They spoke to each other. They were placed in a cell with each other, next to each other in Folsom Prison, was nothing like the bloodthirsty monster that had been presented in the mass media. So that really intrigued me, because really that's the first time I'd heard anyone say anything sympathetic about him in years. And it opened a door to my looking into, well, what does he mean? There's much more to this case than has ever been known. Because at the time, most people assumed that Bugliosi's Helter Skelter book had pretty much explained exactly what the case was about. And the TV movie that was made that year, 1976, for those who couldn't read, put it into the minds of the mass public as well. So that really intrigued me. The interesting thing about Leary is he had snitched on many of his drug dealer associates, and that's how he got out of prison. He had turned state's evidence against many of his former associates, which pretty much means you're a marked man in the underworld.